Imala's eyes were like blades slicing through the shadows, finding what was always there. This constantly made Claire wonder just how Imala saw the world. Had she forgotten what the night looked like? For one who took to the darkness, was there any in her life at all? This wasn't the first time Claire had conjured a small amount of light near her ex-comrade, and even though the extent of its radiance from her palm reached just ahead of Imala, there was no reaction. Her pace hadn't let up, despite the constant twisting and winding of the path. Already, they had passed up several offshoots, but Imala ignored them all. At least that mystery had been solved for Claire. Yet, it was a wonder why the community members appeared at different locations in that main chamber. Then again, why wouldn't they? They were either audience or participant in the rituals taking place in the midst of them. And since they had all pledged so much to the rings, why not have their own reserved seating? Not like any of that mattered to Claire. With every revelation thus far, there was only one she had yet to receive. Wait, Imala, stop. She planted her feet, coming to a halt. Imala heard this and slowed to a stop. Twisting her upper body around, she looked back at Claire. You said at the end, Claire began. The end of what? Where's Samson? Emotion washed across Imala's face before she responded, and it was then Claire recognized her. Oh, no. He wants us to head to the end. He'll meet us there. Meet us? Claire asked. Where is he? Imala pointed at the left side of the tunnel. He's keeping Asham occupied so that we can get out of these caves. Out? Claire questioned. So you know a way? She grinned. I do now. He showed me. Come on. I'll remember how to get back there. She then turned and started running again. Claire ran after her. So, she started to ask after several seconds of going up and down slopes and constantly following the tunnel's wide curve to the right. That was him, right? At the top of that hot spring? Yep, Imala peeped, ignoring another offshoot along the right side of the tunnel. But, Claire continued, what is he? I mean, don't know yet, Imala responded. Claire noticed her pace was starting to slow down. The tunnel made a sudden dip, and Imala's arms spread out to the sides. Her legs parted, and she came to a dead stop, anchoring her feet in place. Her fingers pressed against the tunnel walls. Claire skidded along the rocky surface and collided into her. Oop, Imala squeaked. Claire's right hand had shot past her, holding the sphere of dim light ahead. Her other arm reflexively wrapped around Imala's midsection. What did you? Claire started to ask, but then she noticed Imala's head was lowered. Looking over her shoulder, the conjured light revealed the wall in front of them and the small pit at Imala's feet. Can you hear it? Imala asked. Claire was about to ask what it was she was referring to, but she kept from speaking and just listened. It didn't take long for her to catch the sound of wind. It was faint at first, because she was not only feeling her heartbeat, but she was hearing it in her head. Having a moment to catch her breath, she even thought she felt wafts of that wind coming up from the pit. Wait, she whispered, stepping back from Imala, who was able to pull her hands from the tunnel walls. Is that? Rapids, Imala said, turning to her. Claire held her gaze, questioning, but when Imala didn't say anything, she stepped near the edge of the pit. Holding her light aloft, she leaned forward as much as she dared. Either her light only reached so far, or that was a deep hole. She looked at Imala again. Squinting, Claire said, You didn't come from... She pointed into the pit with her other hand. Imala choked on a snicker, bunching her shoulders near her ears. No. She then pointed her thumb over her left shoulder. I came from there. Claire swung her light around, to reveal the narrow breach in the tunnel wall next to Imala. Her posture relaxed. Snickering, Imala said, "But you can hear we're getting close." She pointed at the pit. Turning toward the breach, she added, "Gotta go down some more." She left the tunnel, and Claire followed her. The narrow corridor curved to the left as it went into a descent. Claire was holding her light as far ahead as she could, but she couldn't see much beyond Imala, whose pace was swift. She was almost sliding her way down while bouncing off the wall, forcing Claire to keep up. "Imala, what did he say?" Claire asked when she found a chance. "About what?" Imala responded without breaking her stride. Claire grunted, almost surprised at Imala's reply. "About this." They went down a steep drop and came to a flat surface. Imala took a few more steps forward and then stopped. Placing her hand upon the wall to her left, she peeked around the edge. Claire waited behind her, not forgetting her question, but she was listening to the sound of rushing water. It was louder this time than all the other instances. Hearing it echo about the space that Imala was spying at the moment, she tried to imagine the size. Rather large. Imala pulled away from the edge to look back at her. "You won't need your light." Claire was still holding it in front of her, elbow resting against her side. Imala glanced at it and then faced forward, leaving the tunnel. Claire started forward, paused, and then closed her fingers into a fist, snuffing out the light. Before she let her eyes adjust, she felt for the edge of the tunnel and stepped past it. Entering the sound of the rapids, she felt the cool mist air swirling about her face. There was mostly darkness, but she could tell the echoes were projecting off a surface far ahead of her. Above, too, she thought she could smell a lax circulation. She was about to look up, but then she spotted a point of light ahead. 2 points, actually. 2 large points, both wide, but one tall. The one in the center was narrow along the left side, but it grew toward the right to eventually curve back down. The one further to the right was in the shape of an arch. Beyond these openings, she could see another rocky surface. The sight of the warm colors made her stop and stare. "Wait, we're," she began, not even knowing if Imala was nearby to hear her. "Outside?" The light reflecting off those rocks at a distance, that was the morning sunlight. She had lost track of time, but now that she had an idea, she suddenly felt exhausted. "Psst!" Claire looked to the left. Her eyes were already adjusting, because she was seeing several impressions of surfaces caught by the light bouncing off that outer wall. Imala was a dark figure among the faint colors. She was waving at Claire. "This way." She noticed that she was keeping her voice low, but loud enough to be heard over the rapids. She started toward her, watching the space before her feet. Imala said she wouldn't need her light, but she was having to sweep her feet with each step. Thankful that Imala was waiting for her, she reached her ex-comrade's side, and both headed toward the rushing water. Trying to get her bearings, Claire listened to the flow, and it corresponded with what she had tried to keep up with ever since entering the first cave. The water was coming from a hole in a wall to her left, which had to be in the direction of the mountains. The loudest sound was to the right, and past the opening shaped like an arch. She thought she caught a small bit of light sitting low among the shadows over there, but now that she was painting a picture of this large cove, the water could have been falling out of another opening. Imala led her to the small canal cutting across. "It's narrow here," she said, standing near the edge and then hopping a short distance. Claire's eyes were adjusting more, so she saw the surface of the water below. There was about 3 feet between it and the stone she stood upon. Being this close, she felt the slight breeze coming off the flow. Finding the other edge only 2 feet away, she hopped over and joined Imala. Turning right, they followed alongside the boisterous stream and headed for the opening shaped like an arch. "You never answered my question," Claire said. "What was it?" Imala asked. "What did he say?" she asked. "Samson, about all of this." Looking back while still walking forward, Imala asked, "What do you mean?" "I mean," Claire scoffed, "the rituals, the rings or whatever." "Yeah?" Imala asked, still looking back at her. "Well," Claire spread her hands to the sides, "does he plan on leaving?" Imala furrowed her brow, coming to a stop, and offered her a curious smile. Claire stopped in front of her. "What about what that Asham guy said? About the rings? Once you've participated, then—" "Oh," Imala responded, her eyes brightening. "You're talking about not being able to quit, right?" She shrugged. "It's okay. I'm not tied to that one." Claire's mind raced as she stared at her. Imala blinked her eyes. "Wait." Turning to face Claire fully, she asked, "Don't you remember? Back at that fort?" Claire lowered her hands. "He was creating the same thing there." "Yeah," Imala said. "He couldn't help but take advantage of those mages there, and since some of them happened to study necromancy, it was too perfect." Her eyes cast downward in thought. Claire said, "I remember. You said death and reanimation was a part of it." "The salt," Imala offered. "Samson said the way to do it is to kill the right number of people for each person who will participate in the rituals. Then they have to be reanimated. The closer they are to the water source, the better, but they don't have to be. Just nearby. Then, when they turn to salt, they season the site." Her eyes still lowered, thinking about how many pieces of clothing, the excess salt filling the trench around the base of the tiny mountain. She wondered just how many people from the other half of the country came over to get revenge. Was it enough for a large militia? "So, how many?" she then asked. "How many did you need?" Imala shrugged again. "Don't know. Samson was setting it up." Claire looked up. "Payments. All of those mages." Imala's smile shrank, but it wasn't entirely gone. "All of those mages, Claire. Before they were reanimated." Claire couldn't push away the memory of Imala cradling Civi's lifeless body there before the cave entrance, leaning down and taking some of the woman's blood, and from a wound she herself had inflicted. No wonder the community assumed her to be Imala's partner in collecting the payments. This second they kept referring to. "Still," she began, recalling some of the rules. "That one mage in the first room. The ice was self-inflicted." Imala rocked her head back with a scoff. "Oh yeah, he was supposed to be a part of it, but he stopped himself from being used." "But then," Claire continued, "even with Civi, did you really not have enough? What was happening up there near that hot spring?" Imala looked toward the inside wall of the cove. "Yeah, that was definitely a first." "Could you really not reach the top?" Claire asked. Returning to her, Imala responded, "I just wanted to see what would happen." Tilting her head a bit, Claire said, "You said you weren't tied to that one, but it affected you. When I saw you back at that fort, you were right next to that hot spring." "Oh," Imala began, and turned around to continue walking toward the archway. "That's because that site hadn't been activated yet. Samson and I were—" She glanced back at Claire with a mischievous grin. "Performing the last rite." Shrugging her shoulders, she added, "Sort of like a christening." Facing forward again, she finished, "After that, I would no doubt have found out how much I lacked." The sun should have been just above the horizon, and with the mountains in the west, Claire could only assume the rock face across from this cove was facing mostly south. That rock face wasn't getting direct sunlight, but it was catching what was possibly reflecting off the outside of this cove. Imala was silhouetted in the middle of the arch. Claire wondered about her attempt at disgracing herself back at the top of that tiny mountain. Had Samson given her that idea? Was it even a factor in the rituals? Asham didn't seem to think so, and perhaps he was right, because Imala hadn't even tried to cover herself since then. Right now, she walked as though she were wearing clothes, so really, did she feel any shame at all? She could always call upon the shadows to cover her, but other than that confrontation with the community's summoner, she made no effort to do so. Maybe the rings caught on to her true perspective on being nude. No one could lie during the rituals. But then, she spoke up, we were interrupted. She stopped just before the opening. Claire saw the line of shadow cutting from the outer edge of the arch, how it angled inward before striking the inside of the left edge. That side of the arch was aglow with early morning sunlight. Imala was standing mere inches from the shadow's end. Looking back at Claire, she continued, Samson apologized to me about leaving. His form is still new. He was able to best those mages because they didn't know what he was, but then when you struck the very core of the site he was constructing... Claire's lips parted in a silent gasp. It's my fault. Imala blinked. What? Claire slumped. If I hadn't attacked like I did and driven Samson away... She looked up at Imala again, shaking her head. Would we have had to go through any of this? Imala snickered. You shouldn't blame yourself at all. It was the agency that sent you, remember? Claire's posture relaxed some. Besides, Imala continued, Samson is still new at being, well, whatever he is now. She shrugged. You just disrupted him is all. She patted the center of her chest. I thought he ran off, so really, it's my fault. He had to come back to this place to get both of us. Claire straightened. So, the site back at the fort still works? Yep, Imala answered, beaming. That's why he wants us to go back. Claire let out a big sigh and slumped once more. Your kid... The ground shook to a thunderous boom. Both Claire and Imala steeled themselves under the resounding crash against the cove's inner walls. Tiny pebbles were knocked loose to rain upon their heads and the surrounding surfaces. A squall erupted from the opening that brought them here. Like an angry gale, it scraped along the bottom of the cove and slapped at the ceiling as it rushed for the two large openings. Claire and Imala dropped to a crouch to ride out the blast. When it hit, they felt the warmth and heard the voices inside. There was no making out the words. They were so frantic that they left the two girls and finally escaped that chamber. Claire looked back through the arch-shaped opening, hearing the storm continuing to howl. She couldn't see it, but it sounded as though it was ascending. She started to stand, but then she saw Imala lying on her back. Her ex-comrade was bending her right leg inward while stretching her arms above her head along the stone. Arching her back, she was giggling. Imala? Claire asked, moving toward her. You okay? Wrapping both arms along the top of her head, Imala looked over at Claire. Still smiling, she let out an exhausted groan. I swear, Samson's gonna be jealous. Confused, Claire asked, What are you talking about? The gale force wind howled above the cove again, grabbing her attention. Imala rolled over on her belly, lifting her head to look out through the arch-shaped opening. She rested her left elbow on the ground while pressing her forearm against the side of her brow. Kicking both feet up, she said, That was a sham that just passed through here. Dropping her arm away, she looked over at Claire. Didn't you hear his voice? Claire had heard a voice, but now she knew it actually belonged to a person. She remembered Asham's form, how he had been a body of fog at the top of that ritual chamber, how he claimed to have been dwelling throughout those rooms before they reached that place. Then she remembered how he had touched them. She had been able to withstand it because of her cloak. Imala, on the other hand, had no protection, even less now that she was completely nude. She hadn't thought about it until now, but when she had crouched down before the gale force wind struck, as a reflex, she pulled her cloak around her. That was how she felt nothing of Asham's presence, while Imala got everything. The smile on her ex-comrade's face told her all she needed to know. Imala jerked her head forward to the sound of another explosion. Claire heard it too, but it was somewhere outside of this cove, somewhere above. It wasn't Asham. It was a different sound. "It's him," Imala gasped, lifting up and hurrying forward before she even stood upright. Claire straightened and hurried after her. As soon as they emerged into the morning light, they had to come to a stop. The edge of the stone surface they stood upon was only a few inches away from their toes. Squinting, they shielded their eyes with their right hands, holding them out to their sides. The sun was coming at them at a slight angle, but they were able to take in the environment. The rock face they saw from inside the cove was on the other side of a deep ravine. Looking down the side of the cliff below, they saw a river at the bottom. It looked so small from this distance, but they assumed it was as wide as the space between them and that opposite surface. The remote cry of the rapids and the swirling currents told of a swift motion through that stone corridor. Claire followed it to the left, noticing, like all the other streams, creeks, and rivers, it was coming from the direction of the mountains in the west. The elevations of the ravine rose in multiple plateaus, forming several waterfalls. The final plateau extended from the mouth of the cave. It bore into the tapered beginning of the ravine. The leveled ground waited a short distance above. Looking to the right, having to reposition her hand when she happened to look directly into the sun, she first studied the surface next to where they stood. She saw where the canal inside the cove had exited through the smaller opening she noticed earlier. The water gushed forth with a louder cry than that of the river below. Looking down again, she found where this neighboring waterfall ended. It was a much longer drop than those of the plateaus further upriver. Bringing her focus inward, the arch-shaped opening just behind them had offered something like a ledge for them to stand on. There were no protrusions or slopes extending in either direction. The entire surface of this side of the ravine was the same as the opposite side, a sheer vertical drop all the way to the bottom. "Okay," she scoffed, tossing her hands up and letting them slap against her thighs. "So now what?" When she looked at Imala, her ex-comrade was looking straight up, her eyes wide and her jaw slack. Claire looked up and found what she was gawking at. The land along either side of the ravine rose and fell toward the east. The tops of either cliffside towered above them. The storm that raced through the cove rumbled between the peaks. She saw no face this time, but she thought it was funny that she could still recognize it. Maybe it was the dark grayish-blue color. Maybe it was the way it moved. But if that was Asham, then where was... The storm blew apart from the middle, the hole expanding outward as a bright blue flash dropped through. It shot down into the ravine, falling past both girls. Having descended at an angle, it struck the opposite wall. Instead of exploding or breaking into millions of tiny embers, the blue object shrank down as it ground to a halt along the surface. When it stopped, even from this distance, they could make out the humanoid shape. "Samson," Imala breathed. She had gone to her knees to grab onto the end of the ledge. Claire stood beside her, looking down. The blue figure was still attached to the side of the ravine. Several grooves had been carved out of the surface from the point where it struck to where it was now. When it moved, they thought they were seeing an arm pulling away from one of the grooves. The body was swinging outward while remaining attached to the surface with its other hand. With both feet anchored in place below, the head spun around and pointed upward. There was no mistaking the dark pits that were supposed to be the face's eyes. Below them, a dark crescent widened, emitting laughter. "If I didn't know any better, Asham, I'd say you were envious." The same voice that interrupted Asham in the ritual chamber, a voice both Claire and Imala knew. "It is him," Claire whispered. He sounded so happy. Beside her, Imala was giggling. Above, the storm rumbled as it spoke. "There is a big difference between you and me, I see. You, Samson, are proud." "Ha!" Samson barked from below. "But it's not the commendable type of pride," the storm continued. "One of arrogance. You might even be growing vain." "I think you've got it all wrong, Asham," Samson cheered and beat his waving chest. "This isn't pride. This is happiness. I've never felt so happy in my entire life." Watching Samson's motions during this exchange, Claire muttered to herself, "Just what is he?" "Free," Imala responded, having heard her despite all the noise. Claire looked at her, but Imala was still clutching the end of the ledge and staring down at Samson. "Don't you get it?" she asked. "Whatever he's done, he's found it. He's found freedom." Samson bent his knees, going into a crouch. Then he dashed away from the side of the cliff. His body lost its humanoid shape and stretched out into a streak of light blue. It rushed upward toward the opposite wall. Colliding with that surface, it bounced away to dash for the other wall again, ascending further. Claire and Imala watched, speechless, trying to follow Samson's trajectory up through the ravine. Already having ascended past them, he dashed his way back toward the storm. Asham had long since gathered himself back together. Now he began spinning in a clockwise motion. "You're still trying this?" he sighed. Samson only laughed in response just before he reached the storm. Piercing through, the clouds didn't separate this time. The streak disappeared inside the gray storm that continued to spin. "We're not even causing one another harm," Asham said. The storm pulled away from the peaks of the ravine, tightening into an ascending funnel cloud. "You would have never trapped me inside those caves," he added, leaving the ravine to climb skyward. Even as his storm shrank due to the distance, neither Claire nor Imala could see Samson. They could only assume he was above Asham, so high above everything. "What is the real reason for all this?" Asham asked. Gazing up from the little perch available, Claire felt so small. She never knew Asham before, but she knew Samson. He was a human of flesh and blood, just as she. Having discussed their paths of the arcane many times, so much was still a mystery to them. They wondered how far they could go. There was never a contest between them, but now it was fitting that this community had referred to it as going beyond, because it was certain Samson accomplished just that. Could she even have a normal conversation with him anymore? Could she contribute anything of value? He would be the only one speaking. "Reason," his voice soared over the ravine. Then he laughed as Asham's storm loosened from its funnel shape. It spread out as a blanket in the morning light. "Maybe I was just trying to get you out here in the sun," Samson cheered. Asham responded. The edge of his storm reached to the north, but Claire and Imala saw a streak of light blue shooting ahead of it. Falling back toward the ground, Samson hurried to drop past the storm before it expanded too far beyond the sides of the ravine. Asham was in no hurry, though. His large gray body was merely relaxing from the tightened funnel it performed earlier. Samson fell below him, aiming for a peak along the side of the ravine opposite Claire and Imala. "You don't know how many times I've drifted along the sky," Asham continued, "seen by the people on the ground as nothing more than a passing cloud, while I've basked in the warmth of the sun. When people marvel at sunsets, it's the clouds that wear all of those colors. Could you imagine it, Samson? Being a part of that tapestry. So no, I don't spend all my time underground. Samson was standing upon the point of one of the peaks overlooking the ravine. To Claire, his posture gave the impression that he was weightless, having no fear of extreme heights. Looking up at the storm, he responded, "Then you should understand how I feel." "Ha!" Asham scoffed. "Is that what this is? A play on empathy?" "What, don't you have empathy for those you guide below?" Samson asked. "Once they get beyond, what do you expect them to do with themselves? Aren't you going to see them off, eager to explore their new lives? Every single one of them will leave here once they achieve what you and I have. Why condemn me?" The storm stopped expanding and just hovered in place. "It's true I care about those below," Asham began, "and that's why I see your actions as a betrayal." Samson spread his arms to the sides. "How?" "Because you have achieved so much faster what they continue to strive for," Asham answered, "but you won't share your knowledge with them." Claire wondered if the summoner that confronted her was still lying in that strange chamber, smothered by darkness because he was too weak to call upon his conjured lights. Or maybe some of the other members had found him by now and were nursing him back to health. Before they sentenced themselves to the rings, they were free to walk among other people. The rags and bandages could only do so much for their presence. The night might have belonged to them, but how much did they long for the light of the sun? "That's because I don't understand it myself yet," Samson offered, his voice subdued from its previous vigor. "Just as I had done at the beginning of my new life," Asham began. "I was a babe in my understanding, so used to my physical form, I found letting go of it was both intimidating and thrilling. It was a slow process, but I was driven by my eagerness and curiosity. So your excuse holds no weight. What I want to know is what you did there at the top of the first ring, Samson. I am convinced that your arcane knowledge of summoning played a part. The summoner of our community, Jaham, is torn between you summoning an elemental and being punished by the rituals for stepping out of sequence. Yet, now I know you have begun your first steps of going beyond. Share with Jaham how you did so. This happiness you experience now, don't you want it for him as well?" "And what of the others, Asham?" Samson asked. Angling his arms at his sides, the surface of his body started waving upward. His feet came off the stone, and he lifted slowly into the air. Sure, Jaham would benefit, but the rest of the community would still be bound by the rules set in place. "Is that why you left?" Asham asked as Samson ascended further. "I can understand the shock of your new life, but now you're trying to tell me you've sobered enough that some guilt has settled in?" "I was just someone passing through," Samson offered. "Your community barely knows me. My leaving shouldn't affect them like Jaham would." "But you have affected Jaham," Asham said. "Thus, the rest of the community is affected." Samson leveled himself with the center of Asham's storm and hovered in place. "But Jaham has already gone so far into the rings, much like most of the community." He pointed a wavy finger at the storm. "And don't try to bring up those who have only begun the rings either. As those before them have suffered, so should they. My experience was just different. Leave it at that." The storm grumbled. "You are something else, Samson, teasing every member of the community, regardless of where they are in their journey through the rings." "They chose to be a part of them," Samson responded, "knowing the rules beforehand. Just let me be a byword." "You would say that, knowing what I am capable of?" Asham asked. "I go where I please. Wherever you go, I am able to follow." Samson shrugged. "But would you waste your time like that? How long would you leave the community to pursue me? Despite your capabilities, You can't be in two places at once. You can only stretch yourself so thin. The storm rumbled. But I have not stopped learning, Samson. Then learn how to teach patience to your community, Samson said, placing his hands upon his hips and puffing his chest out. Work with Jahem while he beats himself up trying to figure out what I did. As far as he's gone already, convince him to finish like he is. Maybe his lust for the blood of those still bent out of shape over the past war will benefit your cause. For the moment, the storm rolled in place without responding. Below, Claire was trying to figure out whether or not she knew Samson anymore. Instead of the cost of freedom, what were the effects? The weightlessness she observed earlier, the idea that she could no longer contribute to a conversation with him, these were just the precursors to the sense of disconnection she was expecting. Not just in response to their camaraderie, but to reality itself, the reality she knew at least. Yet Asham, his empathy for those still with flesh and blood, was present. Was that a sign of his maturity in his new form? Was it true what he said about Samson being a babe in his understanding? The proud words Samson spoke now were merely a reflection of his immaturity. Imala had mentioned something of the sort earlier. Glancing at her now, though, her ex-comrade was still beaming up at the sky like a girl in love. No doubt her nudity played upon a sense of romance, but perhaps there was a hint of a mindset of being ready to let go of the physical. Claire just hoped she wasn't feeding off idealism to the point that the consequences of reality were totally lost to her. Then again, she couldn't blame her while witnessing her lover and another person experiencing life in these new forms. She herself wished Samson would talk to her even just a little. Again, Asham finally spoke. I will admit that you and I can neither harm nor stop one another. But in your new life, don't think that I can't be a constant nuisance. Still floating in place, Samson offered a shrug in response. I guess that all depends on whether or not you can catch up to me. Be careful, Samson, Asham warned. You and I are not the only ones who have learned to go beyond. There is no telling what others like us are capable of. As we dance here in the physical, always on the threshold of the spiritual, there are those who have crossed completely over. They are powerful enough to affect the physical. Yeah, Samson nodded. That's if they even care enough for the physical. He started to descend. As he did so, he lifted his head to hold his gaze with the storm. I mean, that is the end goal, right? He dropped into the ravine, spreading his arms in presentation. To leave all of this behind? To become powerful like them? He disregarded the storm and looked down to fix his gaze upon Claire and Imala. Dropping between both cliff sides, he slowed his descent. Just before he was level with the ledge they stood upon, he tilted backward and lifted his arms to fold his hands behind his head. Lounging in mid-air, his phantom mouth was shaped into a wide smile. So, ladies, he began, want to get out of here? Imala was standing as close to the edge as she could. Reaching out for him, she said, Yes. Claire remembered how he stood at the top of that tiny mountainside inside the ritual chamber, cradling Imala in his wispy arms. Having observed him moments ago, she knew he was capable of more than that. He pulled his hands from behind his head and positioned his body upright. Placing his hands upon his hips, he said, All right, take Claire's hand for me. She wondered why it felt so strange to hear him say her name while in that form. Broken from her thoughts, she flinched when she felt Imala's hand taking hers. Looking back towards Samson, Imala said, We're ready. Hang on, Samson cheered. He leaned forward and dashed toward them. Before reaching them, his body exploded into a wall of wind. When it struck the ledge, Imala squealed, and Claire immediately lost sight of her. The grip on her hand tightened, but her arm was being tugged upward. Using her other hand to keep her cloak wrapped around her, she felt herself rocking backward. The blue currents took her view of the world away, and she was moving. Unable to tell which way, she hadn't known when her feet had left the ledge. From the outside, Samson was a spiraling light blue streak shooting upward, leaving the ravine. He soared past Asham's storm that continued to drift there above the peaks. No words were exchanged between them. The only voice was that of Imala, still squealing as Samson took her and Claire away from there, heading south.